Welcome to Beyond the Bee, an ongoing dialogue about the past, present, and future of the B Corp movement. Co-hosts Emmy Allison and Ryan Honeyman facilitate an open and honest conversation about the B Corp movement, advise companies on how to increase their impact, and provide a deep dive into the new B Corp standards that are shaping our community.
I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lift Economy, and I'm joined again by my co-worker owner and partner, Kevin Bayuk. Kevin, welcome back to the show.
Oh, thanks, Ryan.
So if folks are listening, this is part 2 of a conversation where we go into the 10 principles of next economy enterprises. And in the first episode, Kevin and I went through the first 5. So just to recap, they were need-oriented basic goods and services, which is number 1. Number 2, inclusive ownership. Number 3 is equitable and democratic culture. 4 is supporting a local economy ecosystem. And then 5 is embedding the education into the good or service. And today we're going to go over the remaining 5, which I'll name up top. So number 6, which we'll start with today, is open source and regional replication. Number 7 is being transparent. Number 8 is regenerative operations. Number 9 is supporting movement building for broader systems change. And number 10 is supporting personal growth and development. And so just to recapitulate, we're trying to look at what would it mean for more B Corps to go beyond B Corp certification, beyond the B. And so with that, Kevin, let's just jump back into number 6. So open source and regionally replicate. What is that and why does it matter?
Open source and regionally replicate is kind of a response to a core, almost axiomatic kind of foundational aspect of business as usual kind of development and culture, which is the kind of construct of intellectual property. The idea of intellectual property is something like I create a novel invention of some form, and I then protect it through the laws of the jurisdiction, whether it's United States or, different country or internationally. And then with control over that, with the protection offered by that intellectual property designation, I can then license the use of the invention and with no marginal cost, essentially. So I've done the inventive work, and then I get to almost passively generate income from the licensure of that invention. And
sounds like a great business plan for business 101, right?
For business as usual, right? Which correlates to how it's been leveraged for a kind of wealth creation and an equitable wealth creation kind of pattern of economic development, where in the affluent world, significant contributions of GDP are from intellectual property. And I think it's probably uncommon but important to step back, like way back, like, why do we have intellectual property? Why does that exist? And, and there's like some myths or there's some stories that make sense, right? It's like, oh, then they're partially true, right? It's like, oh, that gives somebody the incentive to do innovative work, right? Like if I do really novel, innovative work, then I should be rewarded for that, which on the surface sounds fine. It's like, okay, somebody works really hard and does some novel discovery and spends all of their time and energy and life dedicated to some kind of novel invention. In practice, intellectual property has become an industry where the question being asked in patent protection is, first, what's novel? What can be patented? So, for example, what are the implications for this? Well, there's a lot of like great herbal medicines, plants that could be used to treat dis-ease or actually support wellness, you could say, rather than novel chemical entity pharmaceuticals, which treat dis-ease. But nobody spends the money or time to study the impact of herbs or to develop herbal formulations that get approved by the FDA because you can't patent them. And so there becomes this very strange incentive to say, how can I get away with the idea that this is novel or some kind of invention so that I can rapaciously generate as much zero marginal cost income as possible? So if I can find a slightly novel formulation of insulin and get more protection for another 40 years and jack the price to or get price control because it's no longer generic, which is unprotected, or it's no longer part of the public domain, then I'm incentivized to do that. And business as usual has all these extraordinarily odd, perverse incentives to manufacture the inventiveness. And what gets ignored is that if the purpose of a business is to solve a human problem, then in any invention or novelty would ideally be an intellectual contribution to humanity that could be shared, replicated, adapted regionally, because humans have similar problems. They're nuanced by place and culture, of course, but we all need food, water, shelter, connection, loving relationships, sometimes transportation, clothing, etc. So the open source and regionally replicate are tied together in this idea that if the purpose of business is to provide needed basic goods and services to solve human problems, one of the best ways to do that is to contribute any novel invention to the benefit of humanity or all life. And open source is just a mechanism for doing that. It's worth mentioning what are the other tragedies of intellectual property in the world of business as usual is that we get other distortions where it's a weird one. Nobody's ever used the best possible power drill. What I mean by that is I forget the companies like Milwaukee and other DeWalt. They're all doing their own inventions to competitively innovate against each other, rather than the companies collaborating. So one makes a novel invention on battery power usage, and the other makes a novel invention on some magnetic property or whatever the thing. And the other company can't use their patent without paying some excessive licensure because that's how they maintain competitive status. And so take any good, a computer, a power drill, whatever. It doesn't have to be fancy technology. Nobody's ever used the best one that's possible in the world where there's a competitive marketplace where intellectual property is leveraged as a tool to compete. So all of the best potential things that humanity could have aren't available to humanity. It's a crime. It's a sad state of affairs where we could actually have innovation that served the benefit of humanity and life at the least amount of energy use or whatever, those kind of things. But we don't because of the construct of intellectual property protections that get little form factor and little amendments made to them to extend the protection so it doesn't fall into the public domain. And it's a whole game that now machine learning and AI is supporting the legal frameworks. So all that's to say is a next economy approach would be to, at the very least, open source, create different types of licensure, maybe Creative Commons or other types of licensing that enable people to use things. An example that comes to mind is and I don't even know if these companies are still around and maybe they've been acquired, but there's a company called Zoom, Zume, and a company called Solenis that they developed a PFAS-free packaging manufacturing process. And then instead of saying this is our innovation, listeners hopefully know PFAS is forever chemicals, fluorinated chemicals that are, largely showing up everywhere on the planet and are correlated with cancer and other outcomes and lots of deleterious health impacts to humanity, almost ubiquitous in the environment. They're called forever chemicals because nature doesn't break them down very easily. And here's two companies that developed a manufacturing process and they open sourced it, made it available to the industry rather than keeping it to themselves and charging some type of exorbitant fee structure on top of it. That's a contribution. Like if you solve a problem around like toxicity, instead of saying, this is a great way for me to create wealth for shareholders or make myself rich or make the company rich, actually, I've maybe created something that's a contribution to humanity. The only other thing I want to say open source, which probably is obvious to everybody, is like, I'd really suggest that we question the notion of invention anyway. I think almost all quote unquote novel invention probably, I hope this is a defensible statement, but is built on the invention of others. And oftentimes, tragically, is actually appropriated from indigenous cultures through cultural appropriation or misappropriation, depending on the terminology. And so, like most of what is we consider as novel that is being protected to exacerbate wealth gaps and inequity are actually not necessarily novel at all, but rather a joint contribution, sometimes funded by the government or by the public. Or so there's a lot of nuance, I think, to the idea of intellectual property. Now, how do we structure something so that there's just rewards for maybe doing diligent work? I think, the Creative Commons folks and other licensure structures enable outcomes where you can contribute to humanity through intellectual contribution, but still have reciprocity. I think obviously we would want more limits on what is a just and right reciprocity for the effort that's required, and eliminate some of these very perverse incentives to not actually create novelty and to exacerbate inequity. So that's like an example.
Yeah, like if you're writing a novel, writing a book, you're not just writing it from, you're sort of leaning on the learning and support of the family or community that raised you, the language you inherited, the school system that contributed to your education, et cetera, et cetera. So it's hard to say you just showed up and did this. It's almost like similar. I'm thinking like Steve Jobs with the iPhone. It's almost like you're repackaging other people's innovations and inventions into something different that seems new, but is like what you're saying is like building off of the shoulders of other people.
And that's not to say that we don't want to encourage creative thinking and contribution and other examples that are, I would call economic, but maybe are less thought of as economic activity. I think it's Jonas Salk or the polio virus, was the polio vaccine, as an example. If you are a listener and consider that a contribution to humanity, my understanding of it is rather than patenting that, protecting it, and licensing it at some kind of enormous milestone fee, or royalty-driven structure, it was gifted as a contribution to humanity because of the horrific nature of polio. Compare that to...
That's what Pfizer did, right? They gifted it.
Yeah. Oops. Yeah.
Oops. Well, I mean, if I'm listening to this, maybe I'm a B Corp CEO or someone in the B Corp world, you might think, okay, but open source, I think you had maybe it got sort of lost a little bit, but you're not saying open source means free in all cases.
Totally. Yeah. No.
So maybe you could clarify that.
I would say just reciprocity, which will mean different things, in different contexts, but reciprocity that enables one to continue providing needed basic goods and services until education can be embedded in the goods or service to the point where all of a sudden you don't need a organization or institution to develop the goods and services. Just reciprocity is important. And there's ways to do that through open source and commons licensing that allows you to contribute to the commons. But you could, for example, have a license where if it's for community use or nonprofit use or some other outcome, it is free in that case or very low cost. And if it's for commercial competitive activity by a multinational large corporation, it's incredibly expensive. So you can have differentiated licensing. There's a lot of creativity in licensing to enable pro-social beneficial outcomes that don't imply that everything is free. but it's also acknowledging humbly that your contributions are a contribution to people everywhere.
Yeah. I think it's worth maybe this, you mentioned it in the previous, I forget which principle it was. I think it was around, maybe education embedded into the good or service. So you put yourself out of business. And then this is on open source. And so people listening may be freaking out a little bit about like this idea of putting myself out of business. All these things, these beyond B Corp next economy principles tend to be pointing towards like, is what you're doing, is just continuing to do what you're doing for the long term worth it? And is that really going beyond B Corp and building next economy? Is it worth mentioning something like, it feels like in order to make that decision, there's also a level of like self resourcing, whether it's like, there's a minimum guaranteed income or something from the government, or like, I'm less feeling vulnerable to putting myself out of business because I'm feeling supported by society or like my community, or I'm feeling resourced. And I'm wondering if there's a gap between people feeling like, okay, putting myself out of business or open sourcing or whatever, but then there's like a bit of like a feeling of free fall. There's no like community resource or like government support to then allow them to do these things.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that might be helpful. Is like, we're probably talking about things on different timelines. A listener might be interpreting like, if I put myself out of business, what am I going to do next year? The likelihood of changing culture enough by embedding education into your good or service to put yourself out of business, the likelihood as an institution for you to have accomplished that mission is probably multi-generational, probably. So there's a transition period, I believe, or as far as we can tell, that we're going to go through to transition to the economy to one that works for the benefit of all life. That transition period sometimes depends on how safe you want to feel. Sometimes they say it probably takes 500 years, maybe 100. Probably could happen in 10, but unlikely. It's probably multi-generational. And the question is the purpose and the orientation of the institution towards the direction of a self-terminating world of inequity and exploitation and suffering, or the orientation of the institution towards a liberated world where everybody's needs are met adequately for a basic standard of living, or even a better standard of living than people have now, and in ways that contribute to the benefit of all life. That's a different orientation. It's a different purpose. What's the purpose of business? Is it to make wealth for some, or is it to solve problems for the benefit of all? And that's an orientation, but time does matter. Second thing that might, if anybody's feeling that anxiety, like, if I put myself out of business, what am I going to do? Or if I open source and if I compromise my ability to maximize wealth for myself, I have no personal security. You're not wrong, especially if you're any listeners in the United States. The personal security apparatus, the infrastructure to make it obvious that your basic needs will be taken care of, that your neighborhood bioregional community-owned clinic for wellness and health next to your co-housing community for permanently affordable housing with permanently affordable, accessible food security and the edible landscape around the structure and all the rainwater harvest, all your basic needs are taken care of through the infrastructure of Living and that there's a transformed education system, transformed government system, transformed media system, and so forth to support basic living needs for everybody. If you're like, Kevin, that doesn't exist right now in total, you are not wrong. Like, that you're totally right. And so what at Lift Economy we often advocate for is that the very institutions that are beyond the B and indicative of a next economy are the ones that are developing that infrastructure. There's huge implications there. It's not just, a little bit of government reform here or there, or the mechanisms of subsidy and regulation. It's like a transformation of what we know as government, as an example, to something that's distinct and likely bioregional and, shared power. That's a very different world. And so anybody's like, it doesn't exist today. You are not wrong. And it probably will take multiple generations. What I guess we're advocating for at Lift Economy is to take that long perspective and orient the purpose and your orientation, the direction that you're going, to one that is supportive of a world that works for everybody with no one left out. And it's quite possible to ignore all those things and have an orientation towards a world that secures your biosurvival, or you and your family, or you, your family, and your company or your community. But what's the use of that in a world that has already surpassed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries and is oriented towards self-destruction or self-termination of human life? Why? Why do it? You have a choice. If you have the information available to you, you have the choice. But like, that's super cynical.
Yeah, I also think there's a whole side discussion on just how the human brain can sort of keep track of risk and like existential things like that.
Totally.
But maybe that's a whole nother, that's a side, we could go deep on some of these. So why don't we, can you say a little bit more about regional replication? Maybe you could mention like the Cleveland Clinic or the Cleveland model, not Cleveland Clinic, Cleveland model.
Go with the Cleveland model. Yeah. Cleveland model is an example of kind of an economic development strategy that looked at Democracy Collaborative was involved in this and so forth. That looked at the city of Cleveland that had a big flight in the 20th century of Fortune 500 industry, lots of manufacturing and so forth, went to other places in the world where labor could be exploited and the environment could be more easily exploited than the United States. And so there's kind of a hollowing out where effective unemployment in the urban core and Cleveland became, is still today an enormous problem, and lots of poverty. But there are still some institutions that are considered anchor institutions, universities, hospitals. They're anchored because they don't flee to places where there's cheaper labor. It's just every town probably has some type of hospital. Every city certainly has some kind of hospital facility, as an example. And by implication, the Cleveland model, just to round that out, is like, okay, well, those institutions that are anchor, especially those that are chartered for public benefit and given a tax deductibility status by the IRS, should or could orient their expenditure, their budgets. What do they spend money on? If they could spend that money, instead of spending that money on multinational corporations that exacerbate wealth inequality, they could actually spend that money for vendors that are providing needed basic goods and services that are actually benefiting, are owned by the community. And so the community could actually accrete or build wealth rather than building wealth for shareholders who are not part of the community. That's kind of the idea of the Cleveland model. The regional replicate kind of pattern there is every city or region has something similar of an anchor institution and a set of basic goods and services, like things like food or health, electricity. There's just a few things that are pretty basic. And the idea of regionally replicate is, instead of having, or take, just to bend our mind for a moment, take like Walmart. Walmart has hundreds of thousands of employees. It's a multinational. That's a model of growth by accretion, right? It's like just keeps accreting or growing. Whereas, just in your mind's eye for a moment, what if Walmart was a network of 10,000 community-owned, worker-owned general store mercantiles around the world that federated and shared a supply web, instead of inuring the wealthiest family in the history of humanity? Not to knock on the Waltons, I don't know any of them personally or whatever, but like, instead of the wealth accreting to very few hands, though that same wealth generated through this general store mercantile function could be distributed to workers and community members to have their basic goods be met. And if we had distributed decision making, or participatory decision making could be, through that federation, could be making better decisions for the environment, distributing supply web activity for more resilient supply webs, and et cetera. So regionally replicate. So what if Walmart, instead of like saying we're going to grow by adding more stores and more areas and leveraging our purchasing power as a single entity, what if they chose instead to say we're going to open source our model and support the next community to have their own version of Walmart, and then the next community over to have their own version of Walmart, and the next community over to have their own version of Walmart. And we can share our purchasing power through a federation of collaboration.
It's almost like Amicus Solar Cooperative in a way, right?
It is. Amicus Solar Cooperative is a great example. Yeah.
So for folks that don't know, there's a lot of different B Corp solar companies, and not only B Corp solar companies, but instead of each of them trying to grow bigger and bigger and just grabbing more market share, they created a cooperative where they can federate the power of their purchasing to purchase panels and like other equipment. They could have that like market power to purchase at a much higher level than they could individually. And so it's a pretty innovative. I'm not even sure if it's definitely connected with the B Corp movement. I think Amicus might even be a B Corp itself. I'm not sure.
That's a good question. I know some of their members, like Namaste, like it is a B Corp. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just give a shout out to Amicus. There's 80 local independent solar businesses, 23 are B Corps, and then 21 are employee owned.
Imagine that, but add a couple zeros, like if that was nationwide or international. And then imagine that for other core basic goods and service industries. That's a powerful economic force that changes the trajectory. This will sound hyperbolic, but that changes the trajectory for humanity. It certainly changes the trajectory for the impact of the wealth or profit margin from each of these entities contributing to workers or community rather than to individual families or shareholders. Or
yeah, and Amicus is a B Corp, just to clarify for anyone who has a question. Okay, why don't we jump into transparent? Principle 7.
Yeah. In some of these, also for any listeners, are like, God, these sound similar, like embedding education into the good or service. Isn't that transparency? Or like open sourcing, isn't that transparency? It is possible that you could, collapse these into smaller sets over time, working with different institutions, organizations, benefit corporations, groups that lift economies we worked with. That's where we landed at these 10 principles. But in some ways, it could semantically be categorized differently. Transparency, though, shows up in a few different ways, I think, in beyond the B context. Well, again, it might be important to say, like, why is transparency important? And you probably have thoughts on this, like just listening to it. But the business as usual has a pattern to not disclose, because disclosure of information creates potential risks internally and externally, risks to shareholder value. The worst cases, of course, are from a market focus where disclosure of toxins in the food or in the product would lead to maybe, wow, maybe I shouldn't buy this carcinogen or whatever for my children, or boy, this food has had these herbicides and pesticides applied that haven't been studied for their endocrine disruption content. Like, maybe I shouldn't feed this to my family. Or so disclosure, unless it's required, which, in some countries or regions like the EU, it's going to be more than the United States in most cases. Disclosure is a threat to market in the worst examples. So transparency is a courageous from what's in my product, what are my practices. Transparency could be considered beyond the B or next economy, because the orientation is not how can I manipulate you into buying this such that you transact, whether it's good or contributive to your well-being or not. That's business as usual. Next economy is like, how can I build a long-term relationship with you as an institution to authentically provide for your well-being through basic goods and services that I've done my best to the best of my ability to make sure that they're safe and contributive to your health, your future, your family, your neighborhood, your region. So transparency, yeah, again, in business as usual, if you are transparent about your supply web, transparent about your ingredients and so forth, it opens you up to competitive messaging from competitors. It's like a big taboo to be transparent externally. The next economy organizations have the opportunity to be transparent. Transparency, though, as a principle, also gets expressed internally in organizations. There's transparency internally would be things like what are our open book management would be an example. It's like how are our expenditure budgets developed or how is our compensation developed? So information transparency internally is meant to empower teams and individuals in the institution to understand what's going on in the business and understand the implications for their life and their well-being within the organization. So what are some examples? I could think of like from the external piece, like there's companies that like how many people listening, whatever device you're listening on, know what's in your smartphone, like ingredients, as in metals and where they came from and what were the supply web practices. Was there any child labor involved? Was there any slavery involved in the rare earth minerals that were used in developing your smartphone? Most corporations are disincentivized in business as usual from letting you know, and you might be horrified to find out. But there's an organization, I'm not going to put them on a pedestal as perfect, but there's an organization in the EU called Fairphone, or that out of UK. Yeah, there you go, who has it as a practice to do their best to the best of their ability to disclose the practices of their suppliers of the minerals and metals and parts and so forth. And that's voluntary, right? It's not based on compliance. And you could say, like, isn't that marketing or isn't that like, it's marketing in the sense that there's a potential for an authentic relationship with customers, but it's not necessarily marketing in the sense of how can I manipulate you by lying to you or withholding information. Do they potentially withhold information? Maybe. I don't know enough about. So somebody listening to this is probably like written like papers critiquing Fairphone. That's cool. I'm happy to look at it, but it's just an example of a different orientation. A lot of these principles are orientation. They might express themselves in different ways, but the orientation is like, how can I be honest and transparent with my stakeholders? And that could be customers, or in some cases, or community owners in some cases, or it could be worker owners or employees in other cases. And the whole, like, is it Jack Stack who wrote The Great Game of Business or whatever? This whole movement around open book management, or OBM, that, organizations like Zingerman's be a good exponent of a type of organization that has good literature and even training on how to practice open book management, with the idea that in a business, there's many businesses today, many organizations, institutions are structured on a information hierarchy where board and CEO have access to information, C-suite has access to information, then senior vice presidents and managerial levels have access to certain information, and employees and contractors have limited access to information just to what's pertinent to their role or function. Of course, like in the complexity of information or knowledge management within decision making to solve problems, well, it's been shown through some analysis and literature and then from lived experience of organizations like Zingerman's that the people who are best equipped to solve the problems that emerge are those who are closest to those problems, but they need the information to be able to solve those problems, to be able to make informed decisions. And that information is oftentimes withheld from them by practice. And so what happens in a lot of organizations, I mean, we see things like resignment or quiet quitting, or employee satisfaction is, at least in the US, is I think at all-time lows. So you have a great kind of distrust of organizations, especially true of large organizations. I'm sure family businesses and small businesses might have more affiliative or familial kind of culture environment, but transparency is a culture builder. It's a way to say, we're in this together. We are honest with each other, intellectually honest. And it's a prerequisite to some of the other principles we talked about last time, like inclusive ownership and equitable and democratic culture. Those principles are, you need information transparency and some training and facility and development, which we'll talk about later, in order to be able to even do those things well. So transparency becomes like a prerequisite.
Great. And I think there's probably more to say that we don't have to get into, but if folks are interested, definitely recommend the Great Game of Business book. There's also Deliberately Developmental Organizations. It's another good read. Robert Keegan, Lisa Leahy, Andy Fleming, and Matthew Miller.
In particular, they have some case studies around radical transparency as a practice for development, but we'll come back to that, another principle in a moment. Yeah.
Okay, great. And then would you say that Reinventing Organizations and Frederick Laloux fits into this principle? Or would that be
potentially? I think some of the case studies that Laloux highlights in that book showcase the idea that having information access or an intranet or distributed information and more of a less a managerial hierarchical control of information, but more of an internal coaching, supportive, problem solving kind of teams empowered with information. Many of the examples that he offers, whether it's through self-management or worker ownership or holocratic structures and processes or sociocratic structures and processes, those different ways of structuring and operating an organization can usually imply a transparency of information, at least to some extent.
Okay. Let's jump in at number 8, regenerative operations.
Oof, yeah, so much to say here, almost too much, right? But at the most basic, and I'm assuming a lot of Next Economy now listeners have been exposed to the term regenerative, the word regenerative, and might also be aware that there's some semantic contention or territory around the word. What does it mean and how is it showing up? And rather than try and be any authority to define it, this is a big category, but one way I think of it is that for every asset or aspect of an organization, that there's a question of like, how could, especially for goods or products or manufacturing, or even if you have an office or a building, how can every asset or aspect of the organization be oriented towards not just sustaining the quality of the environment? Quality, what do I mean by that? Like air quality, water quality, food security, biodiversity. There's a lot of environmental indicators that we could kind of point to and say, like, instead of just sustaining those things, or certainly instead of harming those things, right? Like we can certainly do operational decisions as a business or an entity that actually reduce biodiversity, that reduce soil health, that reduce water quality, that impact negatively air quality, et cetera. And instead of just sustaining them, there's a question mark, and there's evidence in many cases that there's lots of decisions that could be made where the operations and assets of an enterprise or institution can actually regenerate, repair, restore, increase the quality of the air, increase the quality or quantity, alpha and omega biodiversity, that could increase the regularity of the carbon cycle. So this idea of how can everything we do regenerate, restore, and repair? Well, those are a lot of questions but I guess the invitation in this principle is like, it's going to show up 1,000 different ways. For goods companies, it's going to show up in supply choices. It's going to show up in product design. It's going to show up in end of life and waste kind of choices. It's going to show up in transportation options. It's going to show up in the facilities, manufacturing, building, energy use, efficiencies. For service companies, it might show up in technology use or in how or in transportation or in any physical facilities that house the services or the workers involved in an organization. So it's going to show up in a lot of different ways, or it might be through procurement or sourcing as well, even for service companies. So it's a big bag of things. There's a lot in regenerative operations. And we could talk about different, examples or aspects, but I think there's what I would invite, what's beyond the B to me is like every aspect of the organization. It's like, okay, we have a landscape at our facility. How is it irrigated? What's being grown? What's the optimal repair that could be done with this landscape? There's a building that we work out of. Is it just a asphalt shingle roof, or is it a living roof that's creating biodiversity habitat for the local pollinators, or is it providing food security for the local community? Is it capturing and sequestering carbon rather than emitting it or exacerbating the heat island effect? Or if there's transportation involved in the supply web, can we at the very least electrify it at marginal cost, or can we reduce it? Could we be more efficient? Could we decentralize our operation or supplies to reduce transportation? Some of these are just basic economic decisions in some cases. That's like, I would say the Rocky Mountain Institute and others have been, and even Ecology of Commerce and Paul Hawken, like people have been advocating for this for a long time, that decisions that are beneficial to the environment, in some cases, I would argue, some might say in all cases, but in some cases are also beneficial to cost savings, at least over a certain time horizon. And that may be true. I believe there's probably some things that come at a net cost, but they're also important to do anyway. And so the principle is an invitation to the orientation of the question. Like, oh, we have toilets in our facility or in our building. Okay. How could a toilet be regenerative? Oh, well, that's a great question. Maybe it could be compost toilets that contribute to the carbon cycle, or urine diverting toilets, or toilets that use stormwater captured or reuse the water from the building. All the things I've mentioned, if that sounds foreign to anybody, those are all possibilities. There are site-specific regulatory and practical questions about how to accomplish those things. And regenerative operations does not equal toilets, but I'm trying to say like almost every aspect of one's operations is worthy of interrogating and saying like, how could this contribute regeneratively to the environment that surrounds us and within which we work and live? And though whereas there's 1,000 questions to ask for every institution, there's like 10,000 answers. But most organizations that we encounter don't ask the questions.
Or it's like, I have an hour this week to think about things. Tell me the 3 things I should look at.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So how do you respond to someone who might say, sure, I'd love to like sit around and think about my toilet and my roof and all these things, but like right now in Q4 or Q1, our sales are down and we're going out of business, or something like that.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's going to be different. Organizations are going to have different times and context and pressures and to be able to assess these things. And those that are just about to go out of business, it makes it even more challenging. The way I would respond would be like, eco-literacy is really important, both for your organization, but also for your own life. So becoming literate about what's possible, even if you have an hour a week, well, start with that hour. And you could look at materiality. So that's like, get on the scale first, like where are we having the most deleterious or non-beneficial impact to the environment? And what can we do about that? And if the answer is nothing, or I don't know, it's like, well, take that hour and see if you can investigate it. And if you can't, then go to the next one. Again, there's 10,000 questions or 10,000 opportunities to look at that for every organization. If you're in a different context where the question is like, how can I maximize earnings this quarter rather than can I stay alive this quarter? Well, then there's a different degree of freedom, but it might come at a cost to your margin. right? And so it's like, oh, so instead of like generating X amount of profit this quarter, we might generate less profit because we invested in eco literacy education to find out how we can make our operations more regenerative. That's true. I think the RMIs of the world would argue that if you do that diligently and maybe focusing on prioritizing those things that are most financially costly and materiality wise, like whether it's GHG emissions or whatever you're looking at, that you will result in return on investment to do regenerative operations. I partially agree with that. I think that's definitely partially true, that there are efficiencies to be gained over certain timescales that should reduce financial cost as well as create potentially regenerative outcomes. Of course, I do also believe that there are many outcomes that will likely be a net cost. And then the question again, back to this, we mentioned it last time, but when you look at these principles, you'll find that if you were to adopt all of them, then, or Yvon Chouinard has this quote, so like, if I did everything right, did everything the experts say I have to do to succeed in business, I'd go broke. And Vincent Stanley, another person in Patagonia, says, doing the right thing made money, just not the next day. Those are two quotes from, I think, The Responsible Business, one of the more recent books that they wrote together. And so like when you look at these principles and you want to go beyond the B, if you tried to adopt all of them all at once, everything all at once, the likelihood of you being able to operate in the context of the business as usual economy, where you're providing goods or services that have like a business as usual alternative, is unlikely. And so there is a prioritization, a navigation. The paradox we call is the price parity paradox. It's like, how do you provide your goods and services at a price that's near to or close to parity with the business as usual economy while adopting these principles and expressing them in your organization? And we can talk about that later more, Ryan, if you want, but we mentioned it last time. It's like regenerative operations comes up for me a lot when I think about the price parity paradox. If you chose the best materials from the regenerative supply webs, treating people and planet the best as possible for regenerative community outcomes and more agency and determination, and the best biodiversity outcomes and the best outcomes with regards to GHG emissions or carbon sequestration or regulation of the carbon cycle and the water cycle, et cetera, your cost of producing a good is very likely to be much higher, despite what RMI might tell you, than business as usual exploitation economy. And again, I want to be charitable to RMI. They probably are thinking on longer timescales, or they have a lot of qualifiers in there that will justify their position that regenerative choices are always better. Or they might not even use the word always, but just to say that like your cost is likely to be higher. And that means that if you priced your good at the same price as the business as usual entity, your margin is going to be lower or possibly negative. And if it's negative, then you can't sustain your initiative. And so you'll go out of business, if you will, unless it's subsidized, which is one of the ways to address the price parity paradox, but not necessarily a reliable or self-determined one. In some cases it is. In some cases it's necessary.
Yeah. What are a couple of ways if folks are like, well, how do I address the price parity paradox? What do you tell them?
Yeah, well, we could start at subsidy a little bit, philanthropic subsidy or state subsidy. Of course, at some point you're like, yeah, Kevin, that's not a reliable answer to addressing the price parity paradox. And I don't think you're wrong about that. And it's also true that a tremendous amount of business as usual, at least in the United States and other places of the world, is already subsidized through the public, the government. Lots of research and development and agricultural subsidies and so forth. So subsidy is one way to do it. Other ways, and not any one of these is adequate usually. It usually requires a few more. In some cases, these are on the demand side, philanthropic subsidy to lower the price, to basically have some income to offset the additional cost. Another on the demand side is to have differentiated pricing. So I don't think they're B Corp, but there's a restaurant group called Every Table. And they have, my understanding is the same goods, like salads or whatever they prepared meals. And they sell them in one neighborhood at a lower price They make it the food accessible, and they sell it in the same good in another neighborhood at a higher price. Differentiated pricing, as my understanding, is one of their strategies to address the price parity paradox. They still want to treat people well and treat the environment well. And their means to sustain their organization is to have different markets, different prices. On the demand side as well, like we could talk about community ownership or cooperativism. If the people who are purchasing the goods or services are also owners of the organization and get some type of rebate incentive should there be profit at the end, then there's a natural incentive to pay the price even if it's higher because there's maybe a return. So that's not exactly addressing the price parity paradox. It's basically self-subsidy of like, okay, the profits that otherwise would go to shareholders come back to the community. And so even if the price is higher at the outset, so it is like a self-tax, but it's, again, none of these are whole solutions unto themselves. They're just part solutions. On the supply side for the price parity paradox, there's the possibility of very choicefully and carefully, I mean, again, it's like out of the business as usual playbook, especially private equity, but is to partially or vertically integrate, or partially or totally vertically integrate. So in a supply web where you're providing a good, say it's a piece of furniture, it's oftentimes that you maybe buy milled lumber from the mill and the mill buys raw wood timber from the timber company, making a very overly simplistic model here, just a 3-step supply chain. Well, the timber company fells the trees at a margin. So they have a profit margin built into their business. The mill mills the trees, mills the wood, and they have a profit margin. And then the furniture maker, the value adder, they have a profit margin. And maybe there's a retailer. So put a 4th step in the chain. And the retailer also has a profit margin. Well, now that's 4 entities that all have their own profit margin. If they were federated as a co-op or one entity, then that profit in this case would be the selective felling, round pole, fire risk reducing, maybe indigenous led forestry initiative to create the core supply, which is having regenerative, biodiversity enhancing, risk reducing, hydrology benefiting, carbon sequestering outcomes through selective felling and appropriate forest management, paying labor really well. That part of the company, now it's part of the company, it needs no profit margin, right? Because it's part of a larger company. The profit's coming and distributed throughout at the end. And then the mobile mill, light infrastructure, community scale, community owned mill, worker owned part of the company mills the timbers into the base thing for the furniture, the value adding. You get the idea. Each one of those, the profit margin at each step is collapsed into one entity and then distributed across the workers or the community, whoever owns it. And so the partial or total vertical integration of a supply web, either through partnership or through actual integration, is another way to address the price parity paradox on the supply side. It's also true that, I'll say one more thing on supply web, we can keep moving, is like on the supply side, there's what I mentioned about community ownership or worker ownership. In most worker-owned organizations, the compensation differential between the highest paid employee and the lowest paid employee is a lot lower. The ratio is lower, to maybe 3-to-1 or 4-to-1. Whereas I think in business as usual, though it probably matters on which industry we're talking about, but you might be in hundreds to 1 or 300-to-1 or more, in very gross examples. And so that means the inurement or the benefit that's attributed to managerial levels is actually kind of one of the vulnerabilities of the business as usual economy. Because if you take that amount of resource and then you distribute it amongst the workers, you might be able to actually reduce your profit margins at the end because you're not paying those wages, at least in part. Again, none of these are a total solution in and of themselves. When Lyft Economy works with a company, we actually go through all of them until they can achieve the price parity, navigate the price parity paradox to the best of their ability while, adopting the next economy principles. One final thing I'll say about the price parity paradox is back to our conversation earlier, for anybody who's taking a multi-generational frame, obviously we need to transform the regulatory environment as well, the government, so that if a business as usual company does exploit people, does exploit the planet, and externalize that cost, so it's not part of the cost of their goods, so their prices are artificially lower than the cost to society, then let's regulate the heck out of that. If that were the cost of harming, doing the immoral, supply web or treating people poorly, if that was more expensive through regulation, then those who are adopting next economy principles and treating people well and treating the environment well would have a competitive advantage. Of course, we have the big problem right now where the regulatory apparatus is captured, or at the very least heavily influenced by the existing interests of the business as usual economy.
That's why we're fighting the good fight.
Hence transformation, not reform.
Well, let's dip into number 9. Supports movement building for broader systems change, because maybe that dovetails with your last comment.
It sure does. Yeah. So this is a big one and shows up both internally and externally, supporting movement building for broader systems change to dismantle domination culture and moving society towards collective liberation. On the external side, I don't know all the statistics, but I think like in 2023, lobbying from corporations or business lobbying was like $3.6 billion in the United States, or kind of 86% of all disclosed federal lobbying expenditures, compared to just, I think, 40 million or so by nonprofits or advocacy groups. That's a huge disparity. So the Chamber of Commerce and the lobbying groups representing the interests of business as usual economic activity have a disproportionate influence on electoral politics, certainly in the United States, and I suspect around the world, pretty much at all levels, federal, state, local. We could also point to kind of the revolving doors of government, where regulators end up finding financial incentive by working for business, then going back into regulation and doing favors for business. There's super PACs, other dark money, if you will, where you have advantage, where business related PAC spending is, again, measured in the billions of dollars. And so when we say like a next economy principle would be to be externally support systems change, and in this case, maybe focusing on government systems as an example, that is not so controversial of idea in business. That's what business does. Business as usual is a major force for systems change. It's not changing in the direction that is conducive to a livable future. And so next economy orientation, it would be, can we pay employees to participate in, general strikes, like the strike for Black Lives that was organized by Movement for Black Lives, or pay for training and advocacy or organizing or direct action. So actually a business expense for the development of their employees for training on how to do organizing, or PTO for employees with the encouragement for them to vote or canvass or do advocacy work, or, businesses contributing directly to local campaigns in the electoral politics system, or contributing to systems changing organizations that are trying to dismantle electoral politics or captured politics, providing maybe physical space or infrastructure for community organizers or organizing, or organizing their customers or stakeholders to practice radical transformative practices like participatory democracy, or even educating customers or stakeholders on issues and policy as part of their goods and service offerings, or to choicefully boycott or divest from suppliers or cities or states or places who are enacting social or environmental harm, or, joining advocacy platform organizations that are part of systems change. There's a lot of external kind of work that businesses do in the business as usual environment, which if a critical mass of B Corps, for example, if we went from 9,000 B Corps to 90,000 B Corps or 900,000 B Corps, and they were all contributing to systems change, there would be a foil against the power of the Chamber of Commerce or the Business Roundtable or other advocacy groups that perpetuate the inequitable levers of subsidy and regulation to support exploitation outcomes. There would be a wedge against that. There's also internal systems change that I think this dismantling of domination culture also shows up inside organizations, and we'll dovetail with the next principle. But institutions can examine and audit kind of all their policies where those policies might be reifying domination culture, whether that's hiring or compensation, supplier selection or accessibility or budgeting. There's tools like Race Forward has a great framework, racial equity assessment tools, choice points, and kind of equity primes that can be used for institutions to like at least assess and examine where are our policies and operational norms contributing to the perpetuation of systemic harm. And again, probably just like in regenerative operations, probably 10,000 things to do. And it's really asking the question. That is oftentimes the first step for an organization to do.
Awesome. Should we bring it home?
All right. Number 10.
Number 10, supports personal growth and development.
Yeah. I mean, I think earlier in this conversation, we mentioned like how dissatisfied, I don't have all the statistics in front of me, but I think that it was, again, just in the United States for sure, but I think globally there's a great dissatisfaction with kind of the workplace. I think the average American, I think the statistic goes, spends something like 80,000 hours of their life in a workplace or vocational setting. It's a huge, huge component of one's life energy contributed to a workplace in a workplace setting. And just using that as like a benchmark or a thought experiment, like what if the work environment was actually a crucible for learning and personal growth and development, an extension of one's schooling into a deeper education. And the personal growth and development could include mental, like mindfulness, leadership, self-efficacy, goal setting, self-evaluation, just emotional intelligence, self-regulation, maybe some types of therapy and coaching, or even peak states and state change. Physical development. So how can your institution or your workplace encourage dance or exercise or good diet or health or food gardening or other types of light exercise? Or social skill development like nonviolent communication or improv or public speaking or facilitation of dialogue and deliberation, or even maybe spiritual like contemplation or group process or retreat. There's all these areas of personal growth and development that can show up in a lot of ways, whether it's on-site therapy or self-directed training budgets or retreat stipends or PTO for self-development, could be offering online training or team meditation work or mindfulness, book clubs for intellectual stimulation, journaling time in the workplace, nonviolent communication practice groups, lunch and learns, movie or discussion nights, nap breaks for health or, on-site wellness services, personal coaching, fitness breaks, team dance breaks. I'm giving examples from organizations that Lyft Economy has had the privilege to work with. Again, if you're listening to this like, Kevin, how in the heck would we adopt all these things? It's just going to cost so much money. We won't be able to do it. It's a loss of productivity. Again, I could probably point you to Robert Keegan, Lisa Leahy, not that the examples I just offered are part of their DDO research out of Harvard, but this idea of developmental organizations on personal development trajectories where organizations orient around that. They have evidence that suggests that this actually is contributed to the bottom line. Sure, there's a cost in some cases for some training and practices and orientation and so forth, but there is, a return. I think Frederick Laloux, again, you mentioned reinventing organizations, Ryan. I think he makes the argument that self-managed organizations where there's a developmental context for the people working there actually do result in better financial outcomes, if not in profit margin, at least in resiliency. I might argue that some of these things are maybe good to do anyway. There's just the moral imperative of like, okay, if people are investing 80,000 hours of their life into a workplace, how do they achieve those outcomes? A lot of it's through retention and reducing recruiting costs. And, you could look at that side, and there's probably a financial argument that you could wangle for investing in, psychological safety of your team and developmental processes. I'm sure Alphabet or somebody's done that research and, spent money on it. And I'm just not acquainted with all of it. But I also think there's maybe moral reasons to invest in personal growth and development. It dovetails with the systems change work, I believe, as well. One thing we noticed over years of working with worker-owned cooperatives, which there's not that many of, right? There's like 1,000 worker-owned cooperatives in the United States. There's a lot of cooperative organizations in the world, but there's not that many in the United States. We've worked with a number of them. One thing we noticed is that most people who start working in a worker-owned cooperative, and I might say most people in America or in the United States, have little to no lived experience participating in dialogue, deliberation, or decision-making with another group of people. Maybe they vote, once a year, electoral politic wise or whatever, or maybe when they were in college, they lived with a group of people and like had some kind of democratic process, or, the very few people who live in co-housing environments, or, or maybe they're part of a neighborhood association or some extra governmental kind of group. Maybe there's a little bit of experience, but most people just don't have a lot of experience. And consequently, when they think about worker ownership, they're like, it takes forever to make a decision. Like, it's so hard. These meetings, it's terrible. Oh my God, I have to listen and like understand people. I have to express myself carefully. Like, I have to really consider what I'm saying. Like, it's like hard. It's hard to be in dialogue and to deliberate possibilities, make proposals. I have to put myself out there and make a proposal. I have no experience in doing it. And one thing that happens when people go through developmental work, like being part of a worker-owned cooperative, develop practice in dialogue, deliberation, decision making. The side effect is that what we noticed, not like academically, so we haven't had the time to research this like formally, is that a lot of people who are worker owners in cooperative environments end up becoming community organizers, or they're the leader of the neighborhood association. Leader meaning a facilitator. So it's like, oh, what should we do about the local road or the local schools or some like really important decision for the community? They're like, hey, I know how to like facilitate dialogue and deliberation from diverse perspectives. That's what I do at work every day. Like, I actually have experience. And they're like, recognize is like, wow, you actually know how to facilitate a group. Oh my God, like we need you to like help facilitate here, because none of us know what the heck we're doing. And I think that this idea of, while we have institutions for economic activity in this multi-generational transformation of the economy, it's like, let's leverage them for the beautiful extensions of education beyond schooling that they could be as places for development and context. I know what you're going to say, Ryan. Like, if I have an hour a week, like, what am I going to do? I can't, like I'm about to go under. And yeah, all of this is context sensitive, and the price parity paradox is prominent. It's difficult or impossible to adopt all these principles all at once. And so there's a constant analysis of like, what can I do? And if your answer is I can't do anything, then I would argue you're not being creative or thoughtful. If your argument is I can't do it all, I'm with you. Right? It's really hard, but I would advocate it's worth the effort.
Absolutely. Well, given all of this, any advice more broadly or guidance for folks who want to go beyond B Corp, is there a principle or an approach you think might be easier than others to start with that people could take on?
I don't know that any are necessarily easier. Some are more primary.
Like I was thinking like focusing on like democratic culture and like some transparency pieces could be something that anyone could do more.
You probably noticed the interweaving there. Having a democratic culture intersects with transparency, which intersects with personal growth and development. So like there's projects that you could kind of nest expressions of principles together in. I would advocate for getting curious about the principles and really examining what's the purpose of what we're doing. What is our main purpose here as an organization? I think it really does start there. From there, like, hate to go through the operationalizing aspect of these principles, but at Lift Economy, we have a whole training called Next Economy MBA, but like, start with the vision. What do we want to achieve? What's our purpose? Like, what is our vision for the world? What are our goals around that? How do we orient towards being a contributive agent to a future that is something that we value and it's in alignment with our values? Then go to culture and say like, okay, how do we want to be together? How do we want to, like you said, governance and decision making, and how do we want to behave? How do we want to invest in our growth and development? Then I would go to like strategy, which a lot of that is the operationalizing of decision-making frameworks and maybe regenerative operations. And, a lot of the other principles show up in strategy. It could be education embedded in the service, or service design, or good design with basic goods and services. Then there's the operations kind of components of like, what are the systems that can support, whether it's transparency or equitable governance or movement building or supporting the local economy ecosystem. These principles will show up in each of those: the vision, culture, strategy, and operations. And again, you might be listening to this and say like, Kevin, what the heck is wrong with you? I have 1 hour a week, 1 hour a month to think about these. I don't have anything to think about. And I get it. And like all of that work, vision, culture, operation, strategy, we call that organizational design. And we'd advocate that it's probably less than 5% of your person hours is dedicated to those aspects of your organization. Most of your organizational contribution is providing your goods and services delivery. But what we find in many organizations is it's absent or close to zero. It's taken for granted that the purpose of business is to maximize personal wealth optionality or whatever, like, because that's what business is for, right? Or whatever the belief system is, or the BS that's influencing the purpose of business. So allocating, and so what does it start with? Maybe it's like a team retreat. What's our vision? What's our purpose? In some type of multi-stakeholder process to orient around what we're trying to achieve. And once with that, then maybe there's like a values and culture retreat, which might be a day or a half day. If it's a very large organization, that might be a larger investment. And then from there, like, how do we develop a strategy to operationalize? And that might take many months or years to unfold. And what operational systems, for anybody who's listening, for what it's worth, that's what Lift Economy does. We support organizations doing that work, and because it's hard, it's not simple stuff.
Well, thank you, Kevin. It's been great to help share this out to the Beyond the B Corp community. And hopefully this is valuable for folks. If you have questions or comments or feedback, please send us a note, beyond@lifteconomy.com. And we'll have to have Kevin back on the show in the near future. Thanks, Kevin.
You're welcome. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the B. We are trying to grow our audience and wanted to ask you a huge favor that you can do right now. Try to think of one person that might like this show. Then pull out your phone and text them something like, "Hey, I think you might like this new podcast, Beyond the B. Check it out at lifteconomy.com/beyond. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts." Seriously, try to text someone right now. Pull out your phone. Then
follow up with them to see how they liked it. This would be super helpful for us. We deeply appreciate your support.